I have all I could need, but not everything I want. You may say I have reached the stars and I found none. My dreams are my own, but I can't do this alone. I need everyone I can get to make my dreams become.
Hello, my name is Anthony DiRigello. My pronouns are he/him, and I am a young white man with short light brown hair, sitting in a black wheelchair, and using a non-invasive ventilator to assist with breathing. I'm 29 years old and live with a muscle-weakening rare genetic disease called Duchenne muscular dystrophy. 2 years ago, the pandemic made it more difficult for me to connect with my friends, family, and other people living with a rare disease like my own. I'm so grateful to have attended the One Rare Experience, a virtual rare disease conference, because that is where I met the co-founder of Our Odyssey, Seth Rotberg, at a social meetup he was hosting. I cannot put into words how it felt to talk with other young adults about what I was dealing with. I was no longer alone. I had 20 new friends, and it felt like I had known them my entire life. Our Odyssey is the main reason I am still so positive and empowered, even after my difficult week in the hospital last November when I had my feeding tube installed. As I lay awake all night, unable to sleep, I thought about Our Odyssey. Every blood test, every day without food or water, every tear I cried. The memories of Our Odyssey gave me the courage to keep fighting, keep on hoping, to hold on and to survive, to take on the world.
'Cause nothing's gonna stop me, no one's gonna slow me down. Nothing's gonna scare me, no one's gonna let me down. You may think it fazed me, and that may be true. I'm ready to take on the world with you. I'm ready to take on the world and take on the world.
I am a board member of Our Odyssey, a nonprofit that connects young adults impacted by a rare chronic condition with social and emotional support. Since its founding, Our Odyssey has been able to serve about 500 young adults annually in over 130 different rare and/or chronic conditions, 36 states, and 4 countries. Through programming such as social meetups, interactive educational workshops, Our Odyssey provides a reminder that no young adult should feel isolated and that we're all in this together. We invite you to take on the world with us, because this is not my Odyssey, not your Odyssey, it's our Odyssey. There are so many ways you can be a part of this journey. Join us today at ourodyssey.org. Thank you.
Nothing's gonna stop me, no one's gonna slow me down. Nothing's gonna scare me, no one's gonna let me down. You may think it fazed me, and that may be true. I'm ready to take on the world and take on the world with you. I'm ready to take on the world and take on the world with you. I'm ready to take on the world and take on the world with you. Are you ready to take on the world and take on the world with me?
Hello and welcome. I'm Megwin Sanders Andrews, Executive Director of Our Odyssey. Our mission is connecting young adults impacted by a rare or chronic health condition with social and emotional support. And we are so pleased that you are here to join us for this live stream on disability and artistry. I want to give special thanks to our generous sponsors who support our live streams, Albareo, an Ipsen company, and BioMarin. And thank you too to all of our supporters and donors, including Horizon Therapeutics, Alexion Charitable Foundation, the Global Genes Mental Health Impact Grant, Travere Therapeutics, Sarepta Therapeutics, Town Fair Tire, and all of our generous individual donors. A few announcements about upcoming events. Our Odyssey holds social meetups for young adults with rare and chronic health conditions twice a month. We also have an expressive arts program called Epic Arts, a life skills workshop series, and gaming and music live streams. Coming up in our social meetups in October, we'll be having a Halloween costume contest. Dress yourself, dress your pet, win a prize. And we'll also be hosting a Friendsgiving event in November. For information about any of these events, just check out our website at ourodyssey.org. If you enjoy the live stream today, I encourage you to join us next month as well. Next month's live stream is on October 24th at 6 p.m. Eastern, and the topic will be social media marketing and personal branding with guests Megan Starshak and Jenna Green. And now I am so pleased to introduce Regan and Daisy. Regan Linton is a theater actor, filmmaker, and arts advocate, and Daisy Bility is a disabled drag queen. And they are here for a robust discussion on all things disability and artistry, particularly as it relates to performance and storytelling. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Yes, we are so excited to be here. We're first going to start with individual introductions. So I have some slides coming up. Here we go. So first, I wanted to talk about me outside of just Daisy. So I'm Daisy, but I'm also William. And whenever I was 4 years old, I was diagnosed with a disease called polyostotic fibrous dysplasia. Now, this is a rare chronic condition that causes benign bone lesions and bones throughout my body, largely though it's located in my right femoral neck for me. So here's some photos of me. One being in the center when I had my first surgery, and that's my mom and my aunt. But because of my disability, I've always felt important to do advocacy. And I've done that in many different forms. Like on the top left, that's with the Louisiana governor, where I worked in the governor's office to do disability awareness and look at disability policy. Similarly, on the bottom left, it's a youth camp where I was able to share my passion for advocacy with other youth. And so advocacy has always been an important passion of mine. But things really changed for me this summer. Slide should be changing. Let me just give it some time. Here we go. So this summer, I became Daisy. So previously, I had done drag once in my life before for a Vanderbilt drag show. And after doing that, I became very interested in the world of drag. So this summer, I devoted a lot of my time spent to perfecting my drag and really growing it as an art form and finding this as a new way for me to do disability advocacy. Because other than just William doing his usual advocacy work, as Daisy, I could do advocacy in an artistic form and also just do art in general with some disability themes or sometimes completely unrelated. But I chose the name Daisy Bility because it's disability. And I like to think of my character as someone who really champions disability and disability rights. And I kind of am very proud of taking on the disabled label as Daisy. So currently I've been doing most of my work on TikTok. So that's been a lot of fun. So overall, my artistic journey has been kind of interesting because whenever I am Daisy, I have been doing my drag, which has been very interesting. But whenever I'm William, I also do art. So I like to see it as like a future in two parts, where on the left, I'm William with my best friends, of course. And I like to do screenwriting, creative writing, filmmaking, that side of me. And then on Daisy, I like to do a lot of similar things. Like I'll also make TikToks and video editing. but she encompasses another side of my artistic persona. And so I'm glad to be here today as her. So thank you so much.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you. I will take over and now do my intro. So first of all, hi everybody. My name is Regan Linton. I'm so excited to be here with Daisy and with everybody else. A little bit about me. Here on the screen today, I'm a middle-aged white female with short blonde hair. I'm wearing an orange kind of just long sleeve t-shirt and have kind of darker black and different colored rimmed glasses on. I am using a black manual wheelchair that you can't really see on the screen, but it's there, I promise. So that's who I am, and I'm sitting in my living room. So a little bit about me. I grew up mostly as an athlete and an artist. I kind of balanced like playing soccer and softball with also doing plays and musicals in school. But I did grow up without a disability. So I did not identify as having a disability for the first 20 years of my life. And then when I went to college in California, originally for film production, and then I went through a bunch of different majors and ended in American Studies. But while I was there, I was doing some theater, mostly theater for social change, and learning about like principles of Augusto Boal, things like that. And I was in a car accident in Los Angeles on the 10 freeway and paralyzed from my chest down. So understandably, all of us who live with disabilities understand that it completely changes your worldview, or it gives you a different worldview. And that's how I felt. I feel like it transformed the way not only I experienced the world, but also the way the world experienced me. So it was a major physical, psychosocial, emotional shift that I feel like I learned a lot about. Post-injury, I honestly did not think I was going to perform again. I didn't think I was going to be in the arts again. It was, 21 years ago, and a lot has changed. We still have a lot to change, but back then there were very limited representations of folks with disabilities in the arts, and so I kind of wrote it off until I returned to Denver, where I'm originally from, and there was a theater company there called Family, PHAMALY, which originally, when it was founded in 1989, stood for the Physically Handicapped Amateur Musical Actors League, and then they threw the Y on the end. That's a mouthful, and also that it doesn't represent what they do anymore, because they work with people with all different types of disabilities doing main stage professional shows. But I started working with them as an actor, and all of a sudden it was just like my world opened up again, and I started seeing how I could use my instrument and think about my instrument differently and become an artist again. So I got my master's in social work, and then I got my MFA in acting, which I think were a really beautiful pairing, because so much of what we do in the arts is social change, right? And it's also about empathy, and that's what social work is about. So I've been acting professionally. And I also went back to become artistic director of Family, and I also create original work now, which I will talk a little bit about some of those projects. Let me see if I can do oh, yay. So here are just a few photos of me in different shows that I've done over time. Up on the top right, that's Three Penny Opera. That's on the top left, I guess it is me playing Elizabeth I in a show about Elizabeth I. Go figure. The lower left is an adaptation of a Russian play called The Storm, and then on the bottom is when I played Laura in Glass Menagerie, who I have lots of thoughts about that play, but it was interesting to have representation of disability actually in the play that is largely about disability. My motivations as an artist now, I'm really passionate about changing the disability narratives that do exist out there, creating narratives and shows about what I think is missing, and also re-envisioning mainstream materials. So that means being in stuff that's original, that has disability roped in, but also things that don't have disability written into them, and that we can bring the uniqueness of our disability to. I'm very passionate about elevating the voices and perspectives of other disabled artists, and also educating, advocating, and bringing non-disabled people, quote unquote, into the fold. Having kind of been on both sides of the disability experience. I realize that there are a lot of folks out there who are not necessarily bad people. They're not, they're not engaging actively in marginalizing folks with disabilities. They just don't know. And so I really try to keep myself in that space a lot of the time of just educating, advocating. I now work as an actor, a director in both theater and film. I'm going to share a little bit of a film this evening, a writer, creator, advocate, educator, and consultant. And let's see. My current projects, just a little bit about things that I'm working on right now. I'm working on an original show about FDR called FDR's Big D, a happy hour, where I will be playing FDR. So yay for representation of, a person with a disability playing a person with a disability. I've been writing some theater for young audience shows for the National Theater out in DC. I now live just outside DC in Northern Virginia. I'm working on an adaptation of Glass Menagerie that kind of will forefront Laura's perspective as opposed to her brother Tom. I also write for New Mobility magazine. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that publication, but it's for kind of the modern wheelchair user. I do a lot of accessibility curation. So most recently, I worked on an immersive theater project at the Denver Center for the Performing Arts called Theater of the Mind that was created by David Byrne, going in basically advising them on how to make the entire experience more accessible. I also do a lot of consulting and advocacy, sometimes in educational environments like Juilliard, NYU, Carnegie Mellon, and a lot of other schools. And then I was chosen several months ago to be part of a WB Access program, which is with WB Discovery, making a short film based on one of their old classic films. That's been on hold until just the last couple of days when the writer's strike finally resolved. So hopefully we're going to get that going again. But that's just a little bit about the different projects that I've been working on so far. Okay, so I think that's what I have about me. So Daisy, shall we continue on into our topics for the evening?
Yes, that was amazing. Also, I'll quickly describe myself because I completely overlooked that. So I apologize. I am a drag queen with blonde hair and pink eyeshadow, wearing a kind of mesh black bodysuit with pink lipstick.
Awesome. Okay. So yeah, we have a bunch of fun, I hope fun and interesting things that we want to go over tonight. Just a quick kind of overview. We're going to talk a bit about disability as an asset. So working, incorporating disability into our artistry and thinking of it as an asset as opposed to a deficit. Talking about creating an artistic identity when you have a disability. And then talking a little bit about the disability aesthetic, which I think we hear a lot more about in the arts nowadays. And then also personal artistic process as artists with disabilities. And so we'll kind of start out each section sharing a few overall thoughts. And then we'd love to, we're going to share a lot about our own personal experiences. And then I believe there's a way to also ask, questions in the chat and stuff. And I think we'll have time at the end for a Q&A, but also handle those kind of as we go as well, if that's if things come up. So let's start with disability as an asset. So just two main principles that I think are really good to start out with is that disability works as an asset in two different ways. It can enhance and expand the artistry of our work, and it can also influence and advance the process of our work. And artistry and process are both so integral to what we do as artists. So in terms of our artistry, I'll just kind of go down this list and then we can talk and get away from the screen for a little bit, or not the screen, but our slides. So if you think about disability, and Daisy, feel free to chime in on any of these if anything comes up. But when we think about disability, there are so many different things beyond just, how people see us, right? That they may identify us as disabled for any number of reasons, either because we present visibly as somebody with a disability or we identify as somebody with a disability. But often I think the non-disabled world thinks about disability as a circumstance because that's their context for it. So it's like, oh, I break a foot and I have to use a wheelchair for a little bit, or, I was sick for that amount of time in college and, but then I got past it. Whereas for us that live with it all the time, it's a culture. it becomes part of our history, our experiences, our humor, our marginalization. We're kind of connected through this experience of marginalization, and therefore we trot a different path, and that can be very useful in artistic creation, is thinking about the culture that underlies our artistry. Daisy, yeah, go for it.
I feel like, just from a very general perspective, like having a disability completely shapes the way you view the world, even in ways that you are not very cognitive of. And that inherently is influencing your art style. So I think that really goes hand in hand with how how disability culture is influencing art. Um, on that second point with relationships and intimacy, I think this is also a very big asset. Having a disability changes the perspective that you have on relationships in general, whether that's someone who you use for supportive help or lean on, or even just personal relationships with friends and lovers are completely different because of the fact that you have a disability. And a lot of times this changes the way that we communicate with each other. And specifically, whenever we're writing, or whenever I find myself writing like a screenplay or something, like the dialogue that I write tends to be a lot different than that of my non-disabled peers, because the perspective I have with interacting with people is very careful communication, because I have to get the assistance or the support that I need, and I have to be transparent in that way. So the way that I even see communication can be entirely differently. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, totally. And I will just yes and that by saying, yeah, I mean, so many of us that have disabilities have to immediately move to a place of vulnerability and intimacy, whether we like it or not, right? Whether we have caregivers that we're, working with on a daily basis, or whether people want to just come up and ask us questions out of the blue, on the street, regardless of whether we know them or not. I mean, there are just so many ways that our experience lends itself to vulnerability and immediate intimacy. And really, when you're talking about good artistry, what is the thing that we're often most attracted to? It's when somebody is vulnerable and they open themselves up. So that's an asset that we kind of are already along that path. As Daisy, as you were saying, thinking about these next two, like communication style and movement vocabulary as a performing artist, or even, when you're on TikTok, right? Like the things that your style of communication and your movement vocabulary that I think in times past might have been thought of as like, oh, that's a deficit, that's a barrier, right? Oh, you speak slowly, that's a barrier. Actually, it makes it very interesting, and people hang on every word you say. I had a friend who worked with family who had Parkinson's disease, and her speech changed a lot over the many years that she was a performer with the theater company, and it slowed a lot, and she got very frustrated by it. But at the same time, people listened so closely to every single word she had to say, and she could deliver a line or a joke like nobody else because of the speed with which she did it. So there are a lot of ways that we can think of using our bodies and our communication styles as an asset.
Yeah, and I think that this even expands to people with disabilities who are nonverbal and do not use verbal forms of communication. Like, because of the focus on whatever form of communication someone is able to do, there is already some artistry in the way that they are able to communicate. And there's already some creative building blocks there that one is refining in order to survive in the world where they may not even be able to communicate. So I think that's also another side to this same coin.
Totally. Yeah. Or you think of deaf folks that use ASL, you use sign language, and how, I mean, that's starting to, I think, at least in the theater world, a lot of, productions, companies are starting to be very interested in hiring deaf actors, because there is something very compelling about watching somebody who signs communicate, because it is a beautiful process. Moving on, alternative rituals and practices. This, I feel like we could go on for a while, and I don't know, Daisy, if you want to share your thoughts on this, in terms of also like identity and things that come up. But the things we go through, the daily rituals, the things that we experience that often folks who don't have disabilities know nothing about, right? The things we have to do to get ourselves ready, or to reset. They can be physical, they can be psychosocial, emotional, spiritual, which is the next thing. But those are also kind of like Daisy, you were saying, in terms of the culture, that these are like narratives that we don't see. So when you're thinking about like being creative, being out of the box, doing something new and different, we already have those things right at our fingertips because of the different rituals, practices, ways in which we live our lives every day.
Yeah, and pulling off of that, I think that like disability is inherently an intersectional quality. No one is just disabled. So whether that's related to their gender or their sexuality or their race or their religion, any sort of ways, disability at its core is intersectional. So I think from my experience as someone with both a disability and who identifies as part of the gay community, it's especially interesting and enriching to be able to combine both of those intersectional identities, um, in ways that people without those experiences may not be able to. And I think one of the one of the things I was talking about the other day had to do with just like the experience of like coming out. Like that's a core experience for people with disabilities a lot of the times, and people without disabilities who are part of the gay community. So I think it's interesting whenever I have to think of my experience with an invisible disability, where I've had to come out to friends and be like, oh, I have this disease called fibrous dysplasia. I can't do this. I can do this. This is my limitations, etc. And how similar that is to the same experience I had coming out to my parents of being like, oh, I'm gay. This is how I identify. It's a very scary process. And I think that those are stories that don't get told. And a lot of times when they are told, they're told by people who don't identify from these communities. So I think it's specifically interesting to think of disability as an intersectional identity, and the amount of stories and pure artistry that comes out of these diverse experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then to the next bullet, that leads into our psychosocial spiritual perspective, right? Which again, like that's so much of what we do as creative people, as artists, is tap into what are we thinking, what are we feeling, how are we experiencing, our social worlds and our inner spiritual worlds and our mental psychological worlds. And for us, there's a lot that I know personally, like after my injury, there was a lot thrown at me from other people in terms of their spiritual perspective on my experience, on my disability, which was often coming from a place of like what they needed to communicate in order to make themselves feel better about the fact that this accident, this traumatic thing had happened that makes you feel like you're out of control with the world. Well, there's a lot that we exist in every day that, we don't have control over necessarily. And how do we cope? How do we move forward with that? So again, we inherently kind of have a different perspective on the world that we can also channel into our art.
Yeah, I find this point very interesting because one of my majors here at Vanderbilt is religious studies, which is not a major that I was planning on taking up whenever I got here. It was, in fact, inspired by my experiences of grief and my experiences with my disability and trying to come to terms with that. And it really pushed me into the study of these different religions. So I think it's interesting that even outside of just a personal perspective, that our disabilities can fuel these interests into subjects that otherwise we probably would not have been interested in, which ultimately it shapes our entire lives. So I think it's interesting how disability played a key role, whenever it comes to something as big as like picking my college major. It's just the way it's integrated into us as artists and as people in general, is very interesting. And I'm curious, what your perspective on this is, Reagan. But do you believe that it is necessarily the fact that we have disabilities that shapes our perspective on these things? Or do you think it's the lack of accessibility in the wider societal structure that forces us into these positions? Like, would we have would I be experience the grief that would lead me to study religion if it weren't for a society that values able-bodiedness more than diverse disabilities?
I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, I remember after my injury, I was like, if we conditioned, ourselves and young people from the very start, from the time that we're very young, regardless of whether we have disabilities or not, when we, come out of the womb, to believe that, like, oh, right, like we're not all seeking something that's within the mold. That kind of takes us to the next point, but then I also wonder, like, whether we would have better coping mechanisms for, if disabilities are acquired, right? Or any number of things that we discover about ourselves as we move through our lives. Because I think, what you said, I mean, we live in a very ableist society that kind of conditions us that, like, this is the expected thing. And if you're outside of that, then, oh, sad for you, woe is you, kind of thing. And I think if we had a more kind of inclusive culture from the get-go, then I think our experience of grief around that, I don't know, I sense that it would be different. But I'm not sure, because unfortunately we don't have that. So
Yeah, I also think breaking on the side of breaking the molds. This kind of connects with my earlier point with intersectionality. That I think that, like, because our experience as people with disabilities, a lot of us either experience or express ourselves in very non-traditional ways, or at least have an understanding of that as someone with a disability who is forced to be out of the box at times. So I think it's kind of interesting how a disability shapes your perspective of other identity groups as well.
totally. Well, and now having, been a part of the disability community for 21 years, I say this with all the love in my heart for my non-disabled friends and family and everybody. But, like, I think disabled people are the most interesting people on the planet. And I'm so grateful that I'm part of the community, because so many other people are just so bland, and because they just haven't experienced, the types of things that we've experienced, and the types of things that do force us outside of that box, which is the last bullet, which is that we are inherently creative. We have to be, because when we're moving through a world that in any number of ways isn't built for us, we have to constantly adapt and think about different ways and think about how to create a self that is not out there in a little cookie cutter mold for us to fit into. So we are constantly creating ourselves in a way that I think other folks, even though I think everybody actually, regardless of disability, is never going to fit into those molds perfectly. Like, we're all interesting, but I think when you're, quote unquote, quote, normative, or when you don't have a disability, often it can feel like that's attainable to fit into that mold. So people spend a lot more time trying to fit the mold as opposed to creating themselves differently, in their own uniqueness. And I think that's an asset for us, that in some ways we don't have any choice but to create ourselves anew. And therefore we end up being just kind of naturally creative beings.
I agree with that for the most part, but I actually think I'm gonna push back just a
Sure.
tad, because I think it really depends on the disability, and I think there is some diverse experiences. For example, with my largely invisible disability, I feel like for most of my life before college, I was fitting the normal mold. And there was a way for me to be, like, quote unquote normal and feel able bodied and fit in with my peers and not embrace this disabled side of me. And so I do think that rather than disability necessarily being the vehicle being an automatic vehicle for creativity. Where the creativity really comes from is through the engagement with the disability, like engaging with your identity and realizing that it's a part of you and it's something that isn't going to go away. I think that's where, for me personally, that my art and my creative side has really come out of, because it wasn't something that I thought of very young, and it was something that I ran from for a long time. And it wasn't until much, I say much later, like I'm very old, but it wasn't until like the last third of my life that I have found myself anew and outside of a box. And I think that's also the same with my queer identity. The same story of running and then accepting, and in that acceptance, there tends to be a creative spark.
Totally. No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, with all of these things, there's a spectrum of it, right? There's a lot of variability depending on the context of ourselves. And I guess with the creative, I think there's the potential for us to be very creative. But you're absolutely right. I think there are actually folks, like myself, who have a very visible disability experience, who can still get stuck in trying to fit the mold and complete. I have a very close friend who has cerebral palsy and uses a power chair, has a caregiver team. It's pretty high impact cerebral palsy. And he's like 33 years old and has just kind of started to discover the ways in which he can actually own his disability identity and not have to fit into kind of, the expectations that his family has always set, where he's, it's pretty effing obvious, when he's rolling through the world and he speaks pretty slowly and, any number of different, but still from a very young age, he kind of was convinced as though he was fitting in and being part of the mold. And it's only recently, after 30 some years, that he's starting to discover, like, oh, right, I can be who I am. And, so I think you're absolutely right. I think all of us can get stuck, or not stuck, but like all of us can have the experience of being any number of places on that spectrum of how much we are kind of utilizing or throwing ourselves into that identity of disability in order to be great.
And I have one more point I wanted to add on this artistry side, because I think that this is like such a core part of our conversation. I think the way that we're talking about fitting into the traditional mold and trying to fit in, at the same time, those experiences did give me some sort of value and life experience that now feeds my artistry. I was talking about this previously. Me acting as a gay man or me acting as an able-bodied person is me acting as a character. So the difference between me now and me then is, now I'm acting as a female impersonator, but I'm channeling that acting skill into something that's actually productive and creative and art, rather than using that same energy that I was using to be someone who I'm not. Now I can be someone who I'm not, but still be me in some like weird way. But I think it's interesting how it's only the redirection of that energy that has really changed from then into now. And so there is, at the same time, it being like a negative thing and a negative experience of mine, it still prepared me for the role that I'm taking on now. So
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
of course. So yeah, disability is an asset.
Yay, disability is an asset. Yeah, I'm just kind of looking as our outline to make sure that I know we had talked a lot, you and I, when we chatted about this idea of like performance, and the amount of energy that many of us do spend performing to fit into any number of, a non-disabled, straight, whatever that mold is, which does give you that natural presentational experience, that then it really becomes a skill that you
Yeah.
do channel into your artistry.
And even outside of just the act of performing, the act of knowing when to perform, because since we've had to fit into this mold, or that we've tried to fit into this mold of being able-bodied or being straight, I now feel like I have a deeper understanding of people just through looking at them. Like, there is this innate ability that I am able to judge when it's safe to be myself and when it isn't, and when sometimes I have to conceal aspects of my identity. And that now feeds into the way that I write characters and write those dynamics, because your characters also have an ability sometimes to look and understand and perceive each other in ways that are interesting. And playing around with that, I think, is definitely something that has been fun um, to do. So I think there's also a pro of being able to understand people in general differently.
Totally. And I second that in thinking about my experience of having lived, not identifying as somebody with a disability. And again, everybody's I'm essentializing a lot just for the sake of our conversation. But the essentializing, obviously there's more nuance to that. Like, not everybody who's not disabled fits into some, little box, just as not everybody who's disabled fits into a little box. But I do think in general, the non-disabled experience, if you haven't ever encountered some sort of difference that is fundamental, right? We're talking about like these fundamental differences that affect us. Our body is our most basic instrument that we have to use to get through the world. Our communication is very fundamental. So when you have things that affect those fundamental aspects of who we are, I think they give a very different perspective. But I think having lived in that kind of non-disabled, more normative world for 20 years, that gives me a lot of perspective that similarly I employ when I'm in my writing and thinking about those two worlds and how they cross over, how they mix, how we all as human beings are different and complicated in some way. And so how do we kind of cross over those
I, I think I think that's perfect. I think that's perfect.
Yeah, which kind of does lead us to our next little topic. Do we feel ready to move on? Do you want to
Yeah.
for a bit? Okay, let me see if I can. All right, so yeah, and so now we're getting some of this more challenging stuff where we think about what is it to create an artistic identity with a disability. Do you have any thoughts to start us off?
Yeah, no, I like how you just were like, what do you think? But yeah, I think this is something that we've talked about a lot, and this is something that I also think is like a struggle that I've had as an artist with a disability. I think that specifically whenever I was creating the character of Daisy, um I mean, disabilities in the namesake. But at the same time, Daisy is more than fibrous dysplasia, more than like limping while dancing. Daisy is not chronic pain. Daisy is a character who is complex in her own way, just the same way William is. And so it's hard sometimes because I feel like, as someone with a disability, a lot of times I pigeonhole myself. I write characters who are disabled. I I mainly focus on disability identity, and I do the same thing with my queer identity. I pigeonhole myself and limit myself a lot of the times, which sometimes it's great because it means I focus on representing these historically underrepresented groups. But at the same time, there's so much more to us as human beings and as artists that we can continue to explore. So it's constantly been a battle of balance with me, of finding that sometimes I want disability to be my main focus, but other times I just want to sing and dance and be seen as Daisy outside of the disability. So I think that this has definitely been an interesting experience, and honestly one that I think gets overlooked, because I didn't think about it until I was creating TikToks and really thinking that oh, really, what do I put out into the world is how people perceive me. And if I just put out this ability, then do I just become my identity?
Yeah. And I think it's, again, it's like such a nuanced, challenging thing, especially with the last several years where we kind of collectively as a society have become more adept at talking about identity and identifying in certain ways and bringing identity into the conversation. And I mean, I too, so, and you and I had talked about this idea of the yin yang, and that's kind of how I conceive of it as a metaphor where, you know, the yin yang is this symbol of kind of a balance, right? And you have the yin and the yang. I can't remember which one is the white and which is the black at the moment, but when we see it, it's usually pictured in perfect balance, right? But the actual kind of essence of the yin yang is that if we were to see it as the philosophy actually represents it, it would constantly be fluctuating and rebalancing, recalibrating. Sometimes you'd have a lot of yin and a little bit of yang. Sometimes you'd have a lot of yang and a little bit of yin. And that's how I kind of feel about my disability when I'm doing artistic work, that there are some projects that I go and it's all about disability, and it is about disability identity. It's about affirming it. It's about lifting it up. It's about different narratives. It's about talking about it. And it's, you know, it's very present. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is pieces that I've done, again, as I mentioned, like some of the shows that I've done with family where I'm in Man of La Mancha, or I'm in Our Town, or I'm in, you know, any number of kind of conventional plays, Beauty and the Beast, right? And maybe there's some underlying theme that does really strongly relate to or could be a metaphor for disability or vice versa, which makes it more interesting, right? If you're doing Beauty and the Beast and it's cast entirely with folks with different disabilities, it's like, oh, what is that? You know, there's an interesting thread there in terms of what is it to kind of be the outsider of the beast, or Belle, you know, and how do you relate? But there are those shows where I have, you know, nothing is about disability. None of it is. And so then I'm really just thinking about, okay, this is the instrument I have on four wheels. Like, how do I use it? How do I not disregard what I'm bringing on? And also, I think as a performing artist, and I'm sure, well, I would be curious if you feel the same way, Daisy, that, you know, I think it is important to always be aware of what might your audience be coming in with, right? That they have a spectrum of experiences. So they may come in and, you know, immediately see my wheelchair. Well, how as a performer, how can I be cognizant of that and be crafting my performance with that in mind? So that either I'm pushing back against that, I'm manipulating it, I'm having fun with it, I'm, you know, or I'm just kind of going through and I'm just a body that happens to be on wheels. So it is, I think, as we create an artistic identity, it is imperative that we do think about what are these aspects of disability that we're going to bring in that will translate for people in different ways. And then making a decision at any given point in time, well, how much is that going to be part of, you know, this persona that I'm creating, or this character, or this, you know, identity, or this, you know, whatever it is that we're crafting. And I think it also changes, even, you know, like you can have any number of projects where you're bringing it in a different level. But I do think it's important to be aware of it. I put up here, comparison is death. That's, I believe, I think I pulled it from, or a friend told me that is a quote from Taylor Mack. I don't know if anybody on who's watching knows Taylor Mack, but amazing performance artist, queer performance artist. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, like, it's not a bad thing to be aware of, right? Like to observe other artists, to be like, oh, that's what that person is doing. That's really fascinating. Oh, that person leans really heavily into their disability identity. Oh, that person, it's like they don't have any awareness that they're disabled at all, you know? But once you start comparing yourself or like, oh, that's what I should be doing, that's where the danger comes in. So just making sure that like whatever it is you create for yourself, you feel solid in, and, you know, that you can play with, but that you're not constantly just doing it in comparison of somebody else's work.
Yeah, I feel like you just took me back to my Taoism class with your discussion of yin and yang. I was kept
Uh,
thinking about that sunny and shady side of the hill. Um,
yeah.
so I definitely agree with everything you said, and I think in general, like comparison is it can be a very negative thing even outside of just this artistic identity with disability. And I think it's something to always be cognizant of. Um, and you were asking me what my opinion was on performance. Wait, I'm trying to remember. Oh, people come in and they bring their ideas to the table, and they see something when they see you, and that's something that I always keep in my mind and I remember because as a drag performer, I feel like I have a specific obligation to to help continue to dispel the myths around like sexuality when it comes to being disabled, because I feel this is the topic I'm very passionate about, but I feel like too often either disabilities are fetishized or you're completely seen as asexual. And my experience as someone with an invisible disability, I don't experience it as much, but it's still something that I have experienced before. But I feel like because of my position in this kind of sexual queer space, that it kind of is my obligation to provide that type of energy. So I always appreciate using Daisy as a way to continue to dispel that myth. And someone is associating the word disability or Daisy Bility with queer or sexuality, I think is something that is definitely a big mission of mine whenever it comes to like in-person performances.
Awesome. And I'm so glad you brought up sexuality too, because I think that's another place where I feel like comparison is death. And that ultimately does, like, often our sexuality, our sensuality, that aspect of who we are as human beings will also inform our artistry. And that's one place where I feel like the wider world of those people who are not disabled, who are writing about us often without the experience, sexuality is often a place where they get it wrong. And I feel like it's just constant stigma, stereotype, what they think it would be like. And I think that's where we know what it is. And it often is a very unique or different experience. And that's where I think, again, comparison is death. It's like, stay rooted in what you know and the uniqueness of it. And like, there's probably somebody out there who wants to know more about what your unique experience is, because maybe they have something similar and they feel similarly marginalized and they've never seen a narrative that puts it out there in the way that, you may experience it. And then I just, also getting out and experience in the world, which I think is just continuing to remind ourselves that like we are multifaceted human beings as folks with disabilities. And we don't only have to be our disability. You can be a traveler, you can be a teacher, you can be an artist of all different kinds, you can be a sports lover, you can be, there's so many other aspects of who we are. And so it's important for your artistry too, to experience the world as fully as you possibly can.
Yeah, and just the same way as someone without a disability may be unable to completely grasp our sexuality in their art, there's things that we definitely are unable to grasp if we don't interact with other people with diverse experiences. So it kind of goes hand in hand because the same experiences that people are lacking from us are the same experience we're lacking from other people. So continuing to have that exchange and have conversations with people who are different than you, I think is always just something to highlight and emphasize.
Yeah. I thought I'd just really quickly check in with the chat over here because we have just some fun, great comments, including one that was saying yin is negative, dark, and feminine, and yang is positive, bright, and masculine. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for reminding us. Great. Okay.
And then Ali has a comment talking about their learning disability. And honestly, I resonate a lot with that kind of thing. I think because identity is so tied up with disability, I don't know if I would change the fact that I have a disability. That's something that I've thought about a lot.
Agreed.
So thank you, Ali.
Cool. Okay. Yes. Lots of love. Thank you. All right. I think this was the point where I was going to maybe show a short clip of the documentary that I made.
Yes, I think that's perfect.
If I can figure out how to, I think I can just go down and share. Hopefully it won't really mess things up. So just a little bit of context about this piece. So a couple of years ago, I co-directed a documentary that followed a show. It followed the production of Chicago, the musical, when Family Theater Company in Denver, where I was artistic director, did it a few years ago. And we followed the production through the process, the full process, as well as following some of the artists outside of the theater and their experiences living as people with disabilities in the world. And it has been very well received. It was at a bunch of film festivals last year, and we're currently working on getting it on some virtual streaming platforms. So I'll keep everybody posted on when that might happen. But this particular clip is kind of after we've gone through auditions and we've gone through a lot of rehearsals, and we're going into the theater. And this is just kind of a short little clip about kind of going into the theater and some of the process differences that we used at Family that are very disability affirmative and inclusive. So let's go ahead and see if I can do this here. I'm gonna share. Yes, I understand. I'd like to record. Okay. All right. I don't know. Just if I can say deny. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Can you all see that?
Oh, yep.
All right. Let me play a section and just make sure you can hear it too. So one moment. Are you hearing that audio?
I hear it.
Yes? Okay, great. Then I'll continue. Let me see if I can full screen it here. Maybe or not. Oh, I think that's as full as it's gonna get. Okay, here we go.
But hello, you two. Hey, good to see you. Like fine. It was worth it.
Hey, Adam.
Hey.
We're here. I'm just so excited. We're here.
It's the first day in the space, so it's not going to be perfect.
Thank you. Let me see if we have them up here. It does have it. There we go. Thank you. Remind me.
Right, but safety and fun. Yay! There are lips where they're not supposed to be, where you could trip, so we taped them. You see there are not railings here right now, so slow, safety. Keep coming. And Maggie is where the next railing is.
I'm gonna go on your other side, Linda. Okay.
It's very stripper. It is. It's very stripper.
How would you know that?
Hey, you wear many hats in life.
We're here, but it's a big open room. And they've got natural brick walls from the existing exterior walls. It looks more like a place where you're going to have a wedding. That makes it tough to concentrate as an actor. So it's a little bit of a pain in the ass.
I'm tired and I'm not having the greatest day, and that environment is just hard, and we're here for six hours today. But what can you do? This is the venue, so.
A lot of people who have sensory issues or like sensitivity or likes the darkness, especially in seizures.
But obviously, safety is more important.
So in front of you, below you is the.
So as we call us, I'm a total. As blind people, because there's totals and there's partials, and I'm a total. So which means, I can't see shit.
Awesome. Cool. Okay.
In the Amish-y country part of Pennsylvania, where I'm from, there's no services for anybody with disabilities whatsoever.
Light,
my whole goal was to just see if I could make it in New York at somehow, some way. Made it a lot better than, most people do. I got attacked by a roommate. That's why I had to leave.
You were just touching a minute ago. Just the other side. The other side of it, and then.
Oh my God. He's great. He's great. Sometimes just a little overwhelming. Like, thank you back. Saved.
I'm just a little overwhelmed with the new space and everything, but then the acoustics are different, so like a lot of things are kind of amplified, and it's just nerve-wracking.
Then Lord knows he ain't got the smarts. And then you can start kind of moving back in and singing to the audience here as you're moving. Yeah, just so that we get a little more traveling on you. Sorry.
Kevin, do you want to try entering on when Megan is saying $5,000? Now where in the hell am I going to get $5,000? Try entering there.
$5,000? And where the hell am I gonna get $5,000?
Ladies and gentlemen, a tap dance.
Oh, Amos, I knew you'd come. I've been sinful, but right? But I want to make it up to you for what I've done.
Do we really need those two pieces of furniture?
I'm thinking.
Yes. And can you have her
Yeah. Hey guys, we're gonna take a quick 5, and then go right into the tap dance. So, and then we will probably have time to do All I Care About. So please don't go far.
No. Listen, everybody has those moments. I told you, stop trying to be perfect. There's no such thing as perfection.
You're having a crisis of confidence.
Crisis of everything.
Oh, God.
I don't know what brought that on. It was just like,
Sometimes
you're
it
gonna
just
cry
comes.
now.
Yeah.
She was just mentioning of all the.
Right.
Stop
Yeah,
it.
It's because there's a lot happening.
It was just all of a sudden when we were doing that scene, it was like I was out of it, and then it was like, hello, like where's the energy? What's happening?
Totally.
And my body was like, it's time to cry.
Yeah, and sometimes you gotta cry.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just gotta cry.
We all make mistakes. I mean, you have been watching, right? We all.
Have you been watching what's happening out there?
We are mistakes. Are you kidding?
So it's okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Strong
You're
like
good.
bull.
Okay.
That was such a good video.
Well, it's just a short little bit. So in the show, when we did Chicago, Megan, who was there, who kind of had the moment in rehearsal where she was struggling, she played one of the leads. And so I think, this clip, what I was hoping everybody could see for just a moment, is not only like the ways in which family would change like the physical environment, and orient people to the physical environment, making sure that they felt safe and, could get to know the space. But then also the way that it changed our practice in terms of if somebody starts having a rough time, you don't just keep barreling through, which is very different from a lot of non-supportive artistic environments that are just like, go, do, be, fit, do it harder, faster, funnier, whatever. Which kind of just takes us into this idea of a disability aesthetic. And what is a disability aesthetic? I put the little definition of just what an aesthetic is to remind us. So it's a set of principles underlying and guiding the work of a particular artist or artistic movement. So when you think of a disability aesthetic, it's basically the values that are guiding our work that are largely coming from disability. And again, like we talked about with disability as an asset, disability gives us a lot of different things that can support the process of something that might be more, around these values that will create a different type of process and perhaps a better process than often what we encounter out there. So maybe I'll just run down these really quickly. Obviously, it's like values of our disability community that there's a spectrum of the experiences that we're having. We're affirmative of who we are. We come from a strengths-based model where we're not looking at what we can't do, but what we can do. This idea of traumatic growth that, when you experience trauma, it's not just a deficit that you come out the other end with. You also have a great potential for growth. And this idea of pride, disability pride, and pride in who we are. Our disability community, I think in general, again, these are kind of essentialisms, but in general, we're very human-centric. We can be. That every human adds nuance and value, regardless of what our strengths might be or, where our challenges might be. For design, as you saw, like in that clip, we're thinking about removing barriers. How can we design the space to be as accessible as possible for everybody and allow them to navigate on their own so that they don't, some of our blind performers, they're not needing somebody to guide them around the space. Once they get to know the stage, they can move themselves wherever they need to be. Enhanced preparation, that again, preparation is always great. And sometimes when you have a disability, it needs a little bit more planning time on the front end, but ultimately that actually leads to a better process later on. Building in more time. Time is one of the most important and crucial elements of accessibility, and we can all use more of it, right? And like giving, and also being cognizant of how we're using it. I've been in a lot of rooms where I'm working with directors and they're like, oh my gosh, we have no time. And then they spend 2 hours on one tiny piece of a scene. And it's like, well, that was not efficient. So it's thinking, how can we be more efficient and really use our time? Interdependence and collaboration, that's kind of a given in terms of us not just trying to do it all ourselves. And many art forms are collaborative by nature. Services and supports for unique needs. When we were at Family, there were all sorts of different, or when I was at Family, there were different supports for folks that had all kinds of unique needs, on the process, and making that available to everybody, not just people that you openly identify as disabled. Again, communication and interpersonal engagement, thinking of what a spectrum that is and supporting everybody regardless of their type of communication. Adaptation and adjustment, having a plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, so that you can adjust, you can be flexible, make your vision flexible. Particularly, a lot of leaders in artistic spaces come in and it's like, this is my vision, this is what it needs to be, and everybody conform to it, as opposed to how can we keep it flexible and we can all kind of find that vision together. And finally, a couple more: accepting responsibility, missteps and imperfection, realizing that actually makes our art better. We don't learn anything until we mess up or until it's like a little wonky. And then it's like, oh my gosh, this is beautiful and interesting and compelling and creative. And that leads us to a different way of appreciating and evaluating artistic experiences, not just thinking, oh, it's just about getting the fan kick at the right height or hitting that note exactly right. It's actually like, how are we acting as empathetic individuals? Is this compelling? Is it, do I feel invested in this person? So that's enough of me talking, but just want to.
I think that was really, really well said. And to be entirely honest, this concept is new to me. So I have been excited to listen to what you had to say about it, because my look on the internet was I was a little bit overwhelmed. So I feel like this really helped me understand it, and I hope it helped everyone in the audience have an understanding. And I think that what's interesting to me is that I think disability aesthetic is already like a necessary component of modernized art. Like, as we continue to recognize the diverse backgrounds, even outside of disability, like if we recognize the structural needs and the structural differences of people and individuals, regardless of any background, it's naturally going to fall into this disability aesthetic. So we have to even look at this from outside of the disability perspective, because these values and this approach to maintaining art and art leadership is actually needed in a time that has a lot of structural inequalities and issues for other communities as well. So I think as we continue to see this adoption, I think that it's not just the disability community that benefits, and I think it also is just a natural progression of the artistic process as we confront and start to realize self-realization.
So totally right on. Yeah. Well, and what you had said earlier about intersectionality, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like a lot of these principles are the same principles that, for instance, there was a kind of movement that started a couple of years ago called We See You White American Theater. And it was a lot of folks of color that work in theater who put out a very long kind of list of like, hey, here's what's going on. Here's how we're being treated in these spaces. Here's what you all need to change about these structures. And many of them had similar values and principles on those kind of demands that they put out, saying, hey, this is how we're going to be better supported. And so you're absolutely right, whether it's, again, race, gender, ability, any number of ways in which we are unique and maybe have unique ways of showing up in spaces and unique needs because of that. But also it's just being human, like providing a little bit more time, a little enhanced preparation, making sure that we're designing the space to actually work for people and not make it more difficult. I mean, yeah, that's something that, like you were saying earlier, some of these values can be very intersectional and just human values.
I completely agree, and I think this is also an important time to like emphasize allyship, both with people with disabilities, but also in other marginalized communities, because as was just said, we have a lot of the similar values that we need adopted. We're all facing structural inequities, and so it's imperative that we look beyond just the disability community. And I also think that this enhances our art. So just my little intersectional plug to bring it back to that. But yeah, that was amazing. I also think that like kind of just to go back to the video, because I want to make sure that we give it its proper time and we actually discuss a little bit. Well, I just have a question. How was it like filming that?
It was complicated. So I was the director of the show and then also the co-director of the film. So my co-director, Brian, was often there with the camera, racing around, getting the footage that he could get as I was directing. But it actually, I mean, everybody in the cast and crew was so generous. And I think when you're already in a theatrical space and in a space, frankly, I think when we've done screenings, sometimes the questions have been, oh, well, how was it, being filmed as you're doing this? And not only, are a lot of the people that you saw in that short little clip, they are performers. So they're comfortable with kind of putting themselves out there. They also, again, many of them, because of the disabilities that they live with, already experience a kind of social voyeurism on a regular basis where people are watching them and they've kind of developed the skill of like, okay, this is who I am. I'm going to put myself out there honestly. Not that that's easy when a camera is in your face. It's a little different. But I think they very. It was not as hard for them to show up as themselves and just be authentic in the experience that they were having.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight, and I think that connects to a lot of what we've been talking about. And I can just say on the like social voyeurism part, like whenever I went out and drag today, I had to wear this to class. I felt like everyone was watching me, and that was definitely because everyone was. And so one, there's issues to discuss there about how we should approach difference and view each other, but from the perspective of me as an artist, it once again goes back to that performance thing of always kind of having to be on. And while this is like a negative that I have to face these societal pressures, it also provides some certain set of skills. So I do think that was an interesting point, and I think you talking about being the co-director and the help of your other co-director just kind of speaks to the general interdependence and collaboration that happens in art more generally, kind of showing the universality of the disability aesthetic. So I just wanted to make sure we talked a little bit more about the video, because you are such a talented artist, and it was so interesting to see you in the moment directing actors, and I don't know, it was kind of cool.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, and you'll have to watch the rest at some point and see how I had my own personal breakdowns throughout the process.
We're all gonna have to watch the rest.
Exactly. But we felt it was really important to show those moments again of vulnerability in the process going awry, and where we're all questioning ourselves. And that is the thing that from showing the film, it doesn't matter. Regardless of identity, regardless of artistic experience, whether I've had people who are very, very accomplished in, any number of artistic forms come and say, it spoke to me so much when you were questioning there's a point in which I kind of question what we're doing with the show. And I don't know if we're doing it, if I'm supporting people or if I'm just, sending them down the wrong path. And people have been very appreciative of that, because I think as artists, we always have those little bits of doubt, or we always have those moments of like, oh shit, like, am I just completely failing? Is this just going to be miserable and awful? But that's where the kind of courage comes in, to be like, just go for it, and be willing to fall on your face and pick yourself back up.
I think that's something that I don't know if we've talked about enough, but I think art is failure, and we have to stop seeing the artistic process and the artistic product as something that we're striving for, because ultimately the weird thing about art is it's this striving towards an ideal that we never reach, and the way that we end up with our artistic creation is only through accident. And I think that that's just something that whenever we think of disability, it also is very resonant. I think that like the fact that art is just kind of just this happy accident that comes through striving for perfection or striving towards an ideal, it kind of reminds us, I guess, whenever I look at my disability, that that I don't have to use all this energy to strive towards this ideal person, or this idea of able-bodiedness, but instead find the art that I am by accident, because I think there's something very special that comes from the fact that our having of disabilities a lot of the time is a complete accident. It's not something that I voluntarily chose. And I don't know if it's something that I would get rid of, kind of how we were talking about Allie's point earlier. It was an accident. But weirdly enough, my bones being misshapen and made of different material and moldable in different ways, that skeletal structure in of itself is art. That accident, the fact that it isn't the perfect human skeleton, is what makes it interesting and makes it art and makes it compelling. So it's the same way. It's our failure to reach perfection in our art and failure to reach the ideal that maybe we were striving for, that makes the artistic and individuality just stand on its own. So that's like my little rant about art and disability, because I think ultimately,
I'm gonna snap for that one. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, and that's why the film is called Imperfect, because I think I wish I had met you when we were putting together the marketing packet for the film, because it's like, yeah, that's what it is. the whole idea was that, yeah, the true artistry is in leaning into the imperfection and finding those interesting pieces. And really quickly, I want to speak to something you said earlier too about, you know, with the voyeurism, and like it can be scary to put yourself out there, especially when you are risking failure. And often, like when I worked with family and would do a lot of community outreach, and we would do things for, you know, kids, and some of them had disabilities, and their parents would be like, oh, the last thing I want to do is put my child who has a disability up on the stage because, you know, they already experienced. And it's like, no, that's the first thing you should do, because then what do they learn? They learn how to control it. They learn, like, this is how, like, I can actually take my power in this and know how I'm going to present myself. Because people are going to look whether they, you know, and pay attention to you regardless. So kind of your experience going to class in your drag, you know, it's like awesome, you know, then, you know, like, okay, great. Yeah, you're going to look at me. All right, look at me. And also follow me on TikTok.
Yeah, I think this is also just exactly what we were talking about earlier. People look at you and they have an idea about you, whether you like it or not. Yes. And so part of the artistic journey is recognizing this and using it to your advantage.
Totally, which is a perfect setup for our next little piece here. If I can move it forward. Uh-oh, doesn't seem to be going to.
I just keep making little faces into the camera, and it's been like so fun to just see my makeup.
I'm not. Oh, there it goes.
Here we go.
Wait, I think we skipped over it. There we go. Yeah. So, kind of, we were just talking about this, like, you know, these kind of different pieces of building an artistic process. These are just questions that, you know, we often think about, and that I think are helpful in terms of how do you build an artistic process. Do you want to talk a little bit about your artistic process, Daisy?
Oh, that's a good question, because I feel like mine, it's so hard to talk about like your process in general. But whenever my process is very spontaneous, like very spontaneous. It literally just comes down to like even the way that I put on makeup is completely different each time.
I would love to know like how you started doing like it, because I think it looks fabulous, and so I'm just like, I could never do my makeup like that. So like, how long did it take you? What was your process in learning?
Yeah, so I had a boyfriend who kind of taught me the basics of makeup because he did drag as well. And so having that experience with him definitely helped. But if I could show you how it looked even after that breakup, I still was terrible at the makeup. Like I considered putting it in my introduction slide because like I never glued down my eyebrows until like this summer. And the first time I did it, it was just like these caterpillars. And I mean, these are kind of still caterpillars. These are not my best job, but that's because it's been a hot minute since I've done this. So it took me a while, but it has just been constant trial and error, because I found that no YouTube video is going to help me. I watched all the tutorials. I go and I watch the TikToks and the Instagram things and kind of get the gist of what they'll say. But that's not how I learn. I learn through taking a palette and sticking my fingers in it and playing with the colors. And it's the same way that I paint whenever I'm painting. Because I like to paint with my hands. I'm like very tactile with my art. So the process is literally me taking my brushes and playing into the paint until I find that I'm happy with the way that it looks for today. And that's literally what I did today. I started with my eyebrows and I messed up one of them so bad that I had to wipe it off and redo the whole thing. And the eyebrows, like the gluing of the eyebrows takes me about 30 minutes. So wiping all that off plus the like makeup I had already put on and re-gluing, and I was stressing. I was like, I am not going to be ready for this presentation. I'm not going to be ready to go to class. I'm so nervous. So I think in all,
It looks amazing. I would never know.
Thank you. I feel so pretty right now, but the process is very spontaneous for me, and I think it kind of connects uh just how I with how I grew up, because I think life in general is just trial and error, and I was lucky enough to have parents who let me fall on my face and fail, and I think that has been something that has just paid off in so many ways, because sometimes I'll do drag and I wipe it straight off because it does not deserve to be taken a photo of. But I always learn something, even if it's terrible. So I think that is something, yeah. So my process is kind of insane. But as you can see, it excites me and makes me smile. So I like talking about it.
Well, and I think you nailed like a lot of these points. I mean, especially in terms of like, if you're an artist, it's a craft, and the craft looks different depending on, you know, what the artistry is. But that idea of like that time that you have taken, and the experimentation and the trial and error and then doing it again and again and again, like people don't become really good at any kind of art just by rolling in the door and being like, I want to do this. You know, it's like you have to work at it, and you have to fail. You have to be fearless. You have to fall on your face. You have to, you know, and then try it again, you know, which is very tedious, but that's the way you have to do it.
I also have this perfect anecdote to share. So I like to write as well. So for one of my science fiction classes, they were like, write a story. And I was very confident. So I sat down and I was like, I'm a writer. I can do this. I got on my little keyboard and I'm typing, and I write this short story about cloning serial killers. And I thought I was brilliant. I thought that I had just like became the next like mash of like Stephen King and Octavia Butler. You know, we got some horror sci-fi. I turned it into my professor and he said, this is the worst thing I've seen. This is absolutely terrible. This is not you. And like, it was obviously a longer conversation than that. But the gist was, it was absolutely terrible. And that hurt. It hurt because I went in there and I was so proud of it. And I was like, dang, I don't know if I can make anything that good. I think that is my peak. I had a lot of doubt in my ability as like an artist, as a writer, in my ability to be creative. And so I sat down and I scrapped the whole story and I wrote a new one. And I'm not going to tell the whole story because hopefully I can get it published at some point. But it's called The Blue Heron on the Mississippi. And it's a story that I actually ended up getting an honorable mention in a national writing contest for. So I think it's an interesting story to see, just because it really is an extreme that I had like the biggest failure of my life and then a big win right after. And that truly is the artistic process. It's failure, 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 small win, failure, 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 big win, failure, failure. You know, it really is just this process of failing and getting back onto the plate and trying something new. And even you learn something in your failures, because I learned in my failures that a lot about writing. I knew that writing crazy B movies is different than writing a short story, and that I can't really write a short story the same way I would write a movie. And that realization really helped a lot.
Because they're different art forms, right?
They're completely different, you know? But I think that's something I don't know. I get caught up in my brain sometimes, you know, and I just write what comes to my head, and I'm like, ugh,
You're planting all these beautiful seeds for the other points on here, because number one, you brought up feedback, right? So like how you take feedback, and we're all going to get feedback. And I actually think it's one of the failures of the artistic system as it is right now in working with artists with disabilities, because I think there's so much hesitation often to give honest feedback, and they sometimes don't know honestly how to give the feedback because they're not familiar. I think there's a lot of fear that comes up with a lot of practitioners who haven't worked with artists with disabilities, where they're like, I don't know if this is this way because this is just the way they speak, or whether they're making that choice, or whether like if this is part of their disability or not. Like there's a lot of ambiguity, and unfortunately it often results in people just not giving honest feedback, or not even bringing you into the room, not even reviewing your story, not even they'll just be like, oh, that's nice, okay, bye, which is not what we need as artists. We need to feel like put ourselves out there, and that's where I think it's about demanding feedback and saying, no, please, I need it. It might hurt, but then also keeping in mind that like it's not a commentary on who you are, on your character, or the potential of what you have to be. We all have to go through that process of like being honest with ourselves. What is our strength? What is an area of improvement? How can we sit down, scrap the whole story and do it over again, and having those people that you can also trust, that you feel like have enough of an awareness about what you're doing and the context of it, that you can trust their feedback. And then you also, you brought up like this idea of or like reset, and how you keep your motivation going when sometimes you hit those rock bottoms. I mean, the number of times that Florence and the Machine's song goes through my head, like it's always darkest before the dawn, because I'm like, oh no, this feels so awful, but I'm like, okay, but the dawn is coming, so making sure that you have those resets so that you don't just say, oh my God, I'm a failure as an artist, I can't ever do this again. But it's like, okay, this is a little bump. What can I learn from this? And how can I incorporate it and let go of what's not useful to me, and then move on and try it again?
Yeah, and I think that there's two things I want to say there. First, back on the feedback point, I think that like the fact that we live in disabled bodies and we have this experience with disability, it's already made our skin tougher. So I think we need to completely eliminate the perspective that people with disabilities can't handle the honest truth, because we've handled it our whole lives, and we're here to hear it. I also think on the second point, back to the reset thing, I'll be completely honest. We're going to be completely honest. We're going to be back. It has been so hard to keep up with my art as a college student and as someone who has a busy life outside of art. And so this is my little plug to say, take care of yourself, nurture yourself. Your art will find ways to exist, and sometimes you won't be as productive as you want to be, and you just have to accept that. Because I found that I can be productive and I can be motivated, but at the same time, there's other times when I really need to reset. And is it worth me making crappy art? No, I should just take the time to actually reset myself, relook at myself, and make sure I have my life in check, and then get back to the artistic process. And I think that's sometimes really hard to confront because it's very frustrating. And it came in this year. I was like, I'm gonna do TikToks. I'm gonna do 2 recording days every week. No matter what test, I got this. I mean, I have the weekends that'll be full of free time, right? That has just not been the case, and it's been personally very frustrating. But I think giving yourself the grace to recognize, whether it's college, whether it's personal life, whether it's you handling your disability, give yourself that grace and recognize that you will find time for your art when there is time for it. And sometimes some types of art take precedence over others. Like currently, it's been a lot easier for me to sit down and write than it is for me to spend 3.5 hours putting on makeup. and then 2 more hours doing TikToks, which is 5.5 hours. So it's a lot easier for me to devote like 30 minutes in between class to like brainstorm, or like an hour after class to write. Like it's way easier to do that than sometimes it is to do my full drag spiel. So I think finding that balance and kind of surrounding yourselves with a variety of different artistic ways of expression, because it really does depend on your emotions and your time and your capability. And that's something that we need to not shy away from. We need to actually embrace, because the fact that I'm not doing drag as much as I want to isn't necessarily a bad thing, because I'm putting it towards art that is just as valid, just as good, but just different. And so I just wanted to do my little spiel on resetting and balance.
Preach, please. Yeah, no, I mean, number 5 under the goals, you know, one of my other mantras is baby steps or baby rolls, because yeah, we have to realize, I mean, that's another thing that we should remember, or I often tell myself, Regan, you should know this, because living the life that you do, like everything is more of a slow and steady wins the race, you know, and it takes a while. And often we operate according to a different time, you know, time span than other people do. My brother and sister will run out there. They're very much the rabbits. It's like, do. And then they sit on the couch for 4 hours. Whereas I'm like, do a little, 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 you know? And so I try to remember, like, that's okay. And that the reset can look very different at different points. Just like you said, there are some days where, or some, you know, years where I'm like, okay, I'm doing the art. And then I just need like a couple days where I go get a massage and I do some yoga and I listen to some music and, you know, roll out into nature. And then like this summer was real rough for me, because the project that I thought I was going to be working on was put on hold because of the writer's strike. And I was like, what do I do? And I had like 4 months where I just wanted to write and I just felt like I couldn't generate it, you know, but continuing to be gracious with myself and saying, okay, it'll get there. Like there are a couple of different books that I really like. Maybe some folks have heard of The Artist's Way. I don't know. Have you heard of The Artist's Way, Daisy? It's basically like, if you ever feel like you've lost your mojo, like your artistic mojo, it's kind of a way to get back into it. Really what it centers around is just daily writing, where you don't do anything else. There's no expectation for it. You just sit down and you write like 30 minutes every morning, so that you can just kind of get the flow going again. There's also another one by Elizabeth Gilbert, and I'm forgetting the name of it right now. Big Magic. Sorry, it's in my books over here. Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. And she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, which I didn't read, but this other one is about creativity. And she talks about how like genius, we put it like pressure on ourselves that we're supposed to find the genius within ourselves. And she's like, no, the genius is actually out there all around you, kind of like floating in the ether at all times. What you have to do is open yourself to connect with it. And that's just very helpful for me sometimes, where I'm putting so much pressure on myself to create. And then it's like, no, actually you got to step back and like take a break, go do something that has nothing to do with your art, and then open yourself to the creative genius that maybe is floating out there. So I'm so glad you brought up like self-care and yeah.
I think those are both great points. I think the free writing thing is definitely something that I would suggest as well.
And it's therapeutic often, because you're just like catharsis, just get it out.
I forgot what kind of writing I did that was kind of like that. It was like basically object focused writing. So you'd wake up in the morning and you'd set a timer for 30 minutes and you'd focus on one object and then do stream of consciousness writing. And it helped me so much. I did it whenever I was doing a lot of songwriting. And it's a good way of preparing your brain to really take in the genius in the ether, as you described, because you kind of have to turn on the artistic brain to really be able to hear what the world is telling you, even if you hear it and don't comprehend it until later.
Yeah. Yeah, and just engaging with it and enjoying the process where you're not trying to create a product. Some of the times that I love the most are where I'll have a Saturday where I just start like literally I'll just sit and think for like 2 hours straight, and then maybe I'll like play a little guitar, which I'm not very good at. And then and all of a sudden it's like 6 hours have gone by and I'm like, where did that, I didn't eat anything. But it's so wonderful because I was like, oh, I was just like in my little kind of imaginary space for 6 hours, and that's so crucial to just allow yourself to be in that space occasionally and not put any pressure on it to produce.
Do you write using a computer or by hand?
I do both. I still love, I'm 41, so I grew up in the age of not using computers for everything. And so I still love putting pen to paper. There's something very tactile and satisfying about that. And often I will do like outlines on real paper, and then I'll put them yeah. So usually if I'm doing free writing or like my journaling sort of things, that's always on, pen and paper. I never do that really on a computer.
Yeah, I was just curious. I tend to switch back and forth, and I even though I am a beautiful girl, I do not have beautiful handwriting. So while I do write by hand, sometimes I look at it and I'm like, so we do a balance.
Yes, it's all about balance. It's all about balance. I think we're at about 20 minutes left. So I don't know if we just had one more slide. Maybe I'll just put it up. It was just kind of our like final, thoughts on tips, but then we can also, if there are any, where we go? There it
Well,
is.
we can just field questions, and as we wait for questions to come in, we can talk about these.
Yeah, that sounds great. So these are just some steps toward professional artistry. Really, it's just like ideas for if you're gonna do some art. So we've already talked about this first one a lot, like create your own work. You obviously do that pretty darn regularly, I feel like. And I also try to do it. I think it's so crucial to really help you develop that like personal artistic vision, of like who am I? What do I have to say? What do I want to say?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think we've also talked a lot about sharing that work. And I'm actually nervous. Well, not nervous, like in a bad way, but nervously excited because tomorrow morning in my morning 9 o'clock class, which is it's gonna be hard to wake up for, but I have my writing workshop on a piece that I wrote this week. So I am excited to like share some of, well, it's they've already read it because I gave it out at our last class, but like to hear some people actually talk about my piece and kind of just sit there and bask in the feedback. So I think that that's something that's definitely important, not just sharing your work to the internet and the public space, but also those like more private spaces, those groups of peers that you kind of said in one of these, your family, your friends, get those perspectives as well, because it definitely helps to have another artist look at your stuff. And sometimes it can be more intimidating, but a lot of times I find it less intimidating because I always get scared with the internet and putting my art out there. I'm like, oh, this video that I just made is going to live here forever, whether I want to erase it or not. So I just have to like commit and be proud of it, even if sometimes I wanted it to be better, which I feel like is all the time because art is naturally imperfect. But it definitely helps at the beginning to just start with a smaller group and share with friends and peers.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, when I was in LA years ago, a friend of mine who I had known from preschool invited me to be part of this writing group. And I was very intimidated because most of the folks were like actually writing in Hollywood. And I was like bringing my little play in, but it was like the most nurturing, loving, little fun environment. And they loved reading something that wasn't necessarily the same of like what they were writing and working on. And so yeah, I say seek out those little communities, and often people will be really flattered as long as you're not giving them like a 500-page manuscript to be like, hey, do you mind reading this and giving me feedback? But give it in like little chunks. And often people, I think, are very honored to, if you're willing to share your work and say, hey, would you give me some feedback? Like, I'd really love that. So yeah.
And I just want to also highlight kind of what you just said about not really being afraid, because you're at this table and they're Hollywood writers, and that isn't your experience. And being able to share your work though with someone like that has a ton of value. So a lot of the sharing, we have to recognize that we have to go back to that not comparing thing and recognize that we can actually gain a lot from working with people who have tons of experience, and they can learn a lot from us too. We bring a different perspective, and just because it's not backed out with the same experience, that's actually what makes it better. So I think that's something to emphasize. And I think we got a chat.
Yes, I think we did. We got
a question. Would you like to read it, or it's on the screen now?
It is. Oh, it's like magic.
Yes. So the question is, I am homebound due to my disability. What are ways you could involve the homebound community in theater and acting, either virtually or at home? So I think this is a question for Regan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, COVID ended up being kind of a blessing in that way, because I think a lot of theaters adapted and came up with new ways to be making things virtual. I know that I was, when I was at Family, we were making a lot of our classes virtual, and then putting content out to watch. So I would say, I think Family still does that. So number one, I would say look up Family, PHAMALY.org. I know there are other companies across the country, including like Theater for All at Queen's Theater in New York does programming that often they'll have workshops and classes and things that are online. And then I think, I'm always a big fan of like getting off the screen and just doing what you can do in your own space. It's like, how can you do theater at home? Read a play, right? Or like get a couple of friends, or friends or family, whoever's able to come into your space, or if you have folks that are nearby, even if you can't go out to a theater, like get some friends together either in your space or online, virtually, and do a read a script together. Like that's one of the most fun things to do. Read a new piece, a new work that you've heard about. So I think those are some ways. I think there are just a lot of ways, if you're not thinking traditionally about, I have to go to the theater and be on the stage, you can still employ a lot of the same things by just doing them virtually or at home. I don't know if you have a thought on that, Daisy, too.
Yeah, I surprisingly do. I think this is where the beauty of TikTok comes in, but also just in general, any form of social media or social networking out there. One, social networking is a good way of being aware of these type of things, because on Facebook, I know, but on Twitter and all of that, a lot of times companies post whenever they are either accepting, I know for like accepting screenplays, monologues, that sort of thing. So if you're doing some type of acting, I'm sure there's similar type things that are being advertised on social media. So definitely checking that kind of stuff out. But also like sharing your performances to the internet and to TikTok. Just sitting in your room and doing a monologue on to TikTok, I think is something that I would watch. And I think that could be a way of just sharing your art with more people. And even that could lead to connections that lead you to a more virtual, traditional type of theater setting. Because it literally has been, the reason why I'm here today is just from me sitting in my bedroom recording TikToks. So I think just putting it out there, someone will find you if you're not able to find them first. And it also just gives you that experience, and it's also just a ton of fun. So I definitely would recommend any type of social media uploading of performances or any of the sort.
Yeah, and I know, especially, I'm not as prolific on TikTok, so you'll have to forgive me, but I'll do it for you. And for anybody else that wants to make something that they want to share. But I do know, like, there are, especially networks like on Facebook, that you can get into, whether I know Family has like a special actors or friends of family group, where people will share kind of more, smaller opportunities. There's National Disability Theater, which is no longer kind of in existence, but they still have a strong Facebook page and presence. And some of those things, you get into them and then they just lead you to other groups and other, communities of folks that are interested in kind of doing some of that virtual experiential work. So I think those are some of the thoughts that I would have.
I think that's perfect. And I think we have another question, this time from Megwin. I'm going to start reading it.
Yeah.
Disability is often represented by people without disability. For example, autism and curious incident. Given that disability encompasses such a diverse range of identities and experiences, as a performer with a disability, how do you view your role in representing disability as a whole? It's a good question, Megwin.
Mm-hmm. You want to start?
Okay, I will start. I think I don't know if I'm going to answer the question directly. So if I miss something, definitely provide your perspective, Regan. But I think that I feel an obligation whenever I perform to represent myself and represent the disability community. I think kind of what I was talking about earlier about performing and with my name being Daisy Bility, I think inherently when I perform that disability is a big part of my performance, but also like my performance is an active public display of the disability community. So it's something that I value about my art is the ability to be a disabled performer sharing art about disability. But it's also something that sometimes I feel a little bit of pressure, to be honest. But I don't know what else I'd say. Do you have something, Regan?
Yeah. So I think it is very complicated, but there's some things that are not complicated at all, which are, number one, we need more narratives being written by folks with disabilities, right? So even Curious Incident, it was tangential. It was a father he had a son who had or was autistic, and he wrote the play. But we need the person with autism writing the play, right? So that's already baked in. It's already inherent there in the narrative. And then I think when I encounter, so like I did Curious Incident, I played the teacher or the social worker teacher in it, Siobhan, who's not written to have a disability. But me having a disability kind of created a different dynamic with the character that I think gave it a little bit more heart and I don't know, connectivity with the story. But I think, I always keep in mind I'm only one person. And even people that have my same disability, I can meet people that are T4 complete spinal cord injury and they have a completely different experience than what I have. So it's like all I can do is, represent myself. And then if I, obviously those of us that have disabilities are going to kind of inadvertently, whether we want to or not, we're going to be somewhat representative of the larger community. So I try to be as respectful as possible, especially if I'm representing an identity that is slightly different from mine. That's what I try to do with all my characters, So for instance, I was in a play recently where I played a quadriplegic. I'm a paraplegic. So I talked to my quadriplegic friends. I said, I wanted to do do that character as much justice as I could, even though I didn't love the play, which is a whole other conversation. But I try to treat every role with dignity, and I try to treat every story with dignity. And if I feel like the story doesn't have dignity built into it, or if it's naturally or as written, it is exploitative or something, then I will say no to it. And I think that's also imperative of us as artists to have those boundaries that we set for ourselves and say, that doesn't feel like it's uplifting the kind of disability representation that I believe in. And so I'm not going to do it, which is very hard sometimes, especially when it comes with a paycheck. But yeah, so I mean, I think, I am not one that says it has to be all this or all this. Like, oh, well, we always need disabled people playing disabled characters. Right now we do, because we don't have representation. And that's where that's the most clear cut of all. We need more representation, more authentic representation, just more representation in general. I don't think it would be as big of a deal if you had a very famous actor, who wants to play a role of somebody with a disability. Yeah, would I like to see a very famous actor that has that disability? Absolutely. But the second best thing is like, then great, cast that actor, because Tom Cruise is the only Tom Cruise you're going to find, whatever. And then cast actors with disabilities in a bunch of other roles in the film or the play or the whatever. So mostly I think it's like the more representation we have, the more we're going to see it all change. And then we won't feel like we as one artist are representing the whole of this entire community. There won't be that burden because we'll have more representation and more voices in the mix, which I think is the thing that we need most of all.
I think that was beautifully said, and I would just expand kind of what you were saying about doing research. I think we have to be humble in recognizing that our experience with disability is unique and that no two experiences are the same. So if we are handling or writing or performing as characters that do not have the same disability as us, we have to do the same research that other people have to do too. Because just because we have a disability doesn't mean we can universalize or essentialize the experience in general. So I do think that's something to always keep in mind. And something that I like to say is like, I'm speaking and I'm performing for myself as a disabled body and my own experience, because they really are all individual. And recognizing the individuality and the diversity within the disabled experience is kind of what makes it interesting. And it kind of goes back to the intersectional identities that I was talking about as well, that disability can be, your experience with disability can be not just influenced by your disease, it can be influenced by your socioeconomic status, your location, your race, your religion, your gender. It really is a completely different experience depending on who you are. And so recognizing that when we are representing the community, to represent ourselves, but also continue to talk about the diversity within. Because I think the one big injustice we can do, I feel like if we focus too much on just telling our own stories without saying the spiel about the diversity of this disability community, we're going to always leave people underrepresented. And I think specifically in a field that has been too white, which we're two white people on a call talking about it, but it's true, and we can't ignore the fact that disability in the public sphere and in the media has been too white. And we have to continue to, as a community, kind of like what I was saying earlier, if we all are facing structural issues, just dependent on the different identity groups we have to be allies, and we have to continue to talk about the injustices of other groups while at the same time talking about our own. So I think this is just another important point. And I have like a fly in my room, which is the worst when I'm trying to make some like serious statement, because every time I'm like getting a thought together, it flies right in front of my face. But
Pretty imperfect, right? You know?
Yes. But yeah, I think it's just important to understand the intersectionality and the diversity within the disabled experience and make sure that whenever we're talking about disability, that we constantly remind the audience that we're talking from our own personal experience and not to take this as a generalization, and that everyone has a different experience depending on their background. And also continue to push the fact that disability rights is intertwined with other struggles as well. So
I think that is a perfect note to go out on. Yeah. Perfect with the fly and everything. That is just, it's perfectly imperfect.
Perfectly, you know, it's like Call Me by Your Name with the little fly. But yeah, so yeah, you have anything else or?
No, I think that should be our final word. So well done.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming to our talk on disability and artistry. I hope that you enjoyed and you check out the Art Odyssey website. Is there anything you'd like to plug, Regan, before we go off the air?
No, if you want to find out more about me, just reganlinton.com, and that's REGAN, not like the president, but King Lear. Yeah, just go out there, create, make some art, fail, have fun.
Regan's incredible. You got to check her out. You can check me out on TikTok or Instagram at Daisy Bility, DAISYBILITY. And I'd love to talk to you more there. So thank you all for coming. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
I'm ready to take on the world and take on the world with you. Are you ready to take on the world and take on the world with me? I am ready to take on the world. I am ready to take on